Gary Foley's here to talk about his show he's doing at the Arts Centre, and it's a show about Aboriginal political, activism, and it's a very different show because Gary talks about it himself in the show. You go along and see academics talk about things from the outside, but Gary's using a lot of his own archival resources, and it's almost... it's not so much like Zelig, the character Woody Allen had in the movie, because in Gary's archival resources, Gary's there in so much of the story as an activist, and he's telling the story. And welcome to the show, Gary. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you, folks. Thank you.
So we'll get it over with first, and we'll keep telling people it's at the Arts Centre. It's part of the Melbourne Arts Festival. This is very, very good of you to...
very upmarket.
Very. It's not like
it's not. It's none of your Fitzroy flea pits, folks. Fringe festivals. This is high art.
It's at the Arts Centre, the Fairfax Studio, from the 7th to the 15th of October. Previews starting on Friday 7th and Saturday the 8th, and you can get bookings through Ticketmaster. And it's an hour and 20-minute show, no interval. But I was going to say, Gary, you've parachuted to an area that's very culturally different from, say, doing a talk at a university or to a political group. It's part of an arts thing. How did you get this idea?
Well, it wasn't my idea.
Good. That's the best.
I was just sitting there innocently in Northcote one day, and I got a phone call from Lindy Hume, the director of the Sydney Festival, who said to me, "Can I come and buy you a cup of coffee?" And I said, "Where are you?" She said, "I'm in Sydney." Well, I said, "Well, if you come down here, you're welcome." And so she bought me a cup of coffee in Northcote, flew down from Sydney, and I was thinking, what's going on? And she said, I said, "What's the deal?" She said, "I'd like you to consider doing a one-man show for the Sydney Festival." And I was a bit taken aback, but at the same time I thought to myself, That's interesting. That's an interesting idea. And I said, "What do you mean? What sort of show?" She said, "Just what you do." I said, "That sounds even more interesting." And so I reluctantly said yes on the basis that this was going to be next January, and that was last January, and I had a year because I'm teaching fairly solidly this year, and I'm up to my ears in work and I didn't need any more. So I said, "Well, if it's a year ahead, no problem." And then before I knew what's going on, Lindy surreptitiously apparently went and had a chat to the director of the Melbourne Festival, apparently with a view to trying to halve her costs, talked him into get me to do it in Melbourne. And next thing I know, I'm in a meeting with Melbourne and Sydney directors telling me that I'm doing a show in Melbourne in October. And so I wasn't able to get out of it. It's a corner you paint yourself into.
I saw you do an early, almost kind of demo version of the show at Trades Hall last month, where it was in one of those beautiful crumbling rooms there, to a packed room of more people from the political area who
Indeed.
Rather than from an arts area.
An area of politics that aren't exactly renowned for their sense of humour, but they actually laughed at my talk, which
Yes.
I was really surprised about.
Yeah, well, your presence in the room, it was organised by, you were referring to them as Trotskyites or
Oh, did it? Was
something.
I as unkind as
you were being quite dishing out a few cavalier quips about them.
Well, I had a few of my old mates from the Maoist from 40 years ago in the audience, so I sort of felt a little bit obliged. I was sort of caught between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, it was it was a room full of much camaraderie anyway, and you I must say that the story you told was quite riveting, and the way you told it, and I wonder if it's going to... I could say to people who are thinking of going to see the show at the Arts Centre the 7th to the 15th that I guarantee Gary will get through an hour and 20 minutes and we'll still have stuff to say because...
Well, this is right. I mean, when I first agreed to an hour and a half, I thought, that's a breeze. But then I realised that trying to condense the story that I normally tell in an hour and a half is going to be difficult. But That's right. It just means that I try and pick out the best bits.
Because you're so used to speaking publicly, did you find that you wrote the show really quickly?
Well, the show hasn't been written. It's going to be my standard improvised production. I've been giving the same talk for about 40 years, with new chapters being added as they're sort of lived out. And so I know the story pretty well, and it's essentially, it's not really about me, it's about events and people that inspired me. It's about the unknown history of Australia, the history of Australia they don't teach in schools, but the history of Australia that it's important for people to know if they're to try and make any sort of sense of what's going on in Aboriginal affairs in Australia today. I mean, we've got some pretty serious human rights abuses continuing to occur, on the part of government, and because there's this misconception about, or complete lack of knowledge about so much of the history that I say is important to know, people sort of not quite sure what to think or where to stand.
Can I just ask, like you mentioned before, you've been doing a lot of teaching, and you say this is like your normal teaching thing you've been doing for 40 years, but recently, and you talk about it in the show, you actually entered a kind of academic world and finished your education and got a degree to teach history. That's quite different from what you would have been doing.
I don't know, because
30 years ago.
You see, one of the ironies of me very late in life, going to university at the age of 45 and finishing when I'm in my 50s, and becoming a historian in my 50s, is one of the great ironies of that is that the only subject that I failed in the 1965 New South Wales school certificate was history. It's a tremendous irony, because I always had this fascination and obsession with history even before I became a political activist, when I was a kid even. And yet I failed history in high school. And when I thought about it over the years, it was because of the way in which history was taught. It was partly about the fact that in the 50s and 60s, Australian history really was the history of the British Empire. I mean, that's what we were taught, and so it didn't really turn me on. But also the way in which history was taught, and I think most of the students who I've taught over the last 10 years or more now could attest that my style of teaching history is certainly not like your average sort of leather-elbowed academic at the University of Melbourne. I believe not only do I think what the history that I teach is important, I think it's also important to convey that history and try and generate a response in students and get young students as interested and as passionate and realise just how extraordinarily interesting Australian history is regardless.
You talked in the show, I saw, it's very riveting talk you do, because your own personal history is put to a national story. And you just mentioned then, late in life, you got furthered your education, and you refer to 1960s school education. And in your talk, you talk quite, it's not bitterly, but you're quite upset that your education was not something you finished earlier on, and then through your learning, you actually talk about it, the first Aboriginal Australian to get a university degree is very recent.
Well, I mean, the first...
As compared to, say, African Americans.
I mean, the first Aboriginal university graduate was in the 1960s, and it wasn't Charlie Perkins, but Charlie Perkins was about the second or third, and that was in 1965, whereas you look at African Americans or American Indians or Maori people in New Zealand, the first graduates from amongst their ranks all more than 100, sometimes 150 years ago. And that sort of is an example of the extent to which Aboriginal people were effectively excluded from educational opportunities right up to when I was going to high school. And even when I was going to high school, I eventually got kicked out of kicked out of high school because I was young, gifted and black.
Yeah.
But, I mean, you know, that's part of the story and part of the story that I'll be telling. And the only way it affects, you know, the only way I enter the story is because my experiences were typical in New South Wales in the 50s and 60s of the first generation of Aboriginal kids in New South Wales who were given a small opportunity at education, a small opportunity. And when I got to Sydney a couple of years after I finished high school, I met lots of other people of my generation who also had been given limited opportunities. But we took that limited knowledge they enabled us to get and we turned it into a passion amongst ourselves for a thirst for knowledge about what was going on in the world, trying to make sense of what was happening to us as Aboriginal people in the Redfern ghetto and why we were being treated this way. And it was through that little bit of knowledge that they gave us that we managed to find out all sorts of interesting stuff about the world. Like, you know, half the world had been through our experience and there were lots of other people in other parts of the world who'd sort of addressed the same sort of problems in different sorts of ways. And this is how, you know, someone like Marcus Garvey comes into the story. Most Australians have got no idea that Jack Johnson, the most famous black man on the planet in 1907...
Black boxer, yeah.
African American, the first black world champion, the one from whom the term Great White Hope derives, because, you know, the white world was horrified that, you know, the best fighter in the world was a black man, and so they were looking for the Great White Hope to beat Jack Johnson.
He fought enormous fights, like enormous crowds in Sydney and Melbourne at that time, yeah.
Well, Jack Johnson fought in Sydney at the Sydney Stadium in 1980, fought a man called Tommy Burns, beat the shit out of him. To such an extent, Tommy Burns was a white man, to such an extent he beat the shit out of him that film footage of that fight was banned in America for 35 years because, you know, people were horrified, didn't want to see a black man beating up a white man of that era, you know. Now, what most Australians don't know is that Jack Johnson was in Australia a year before that famous fight. That fight was, in fact, the biggest sporting event in Australian history right up until the Melbourne Olympic Games in the 1950s. You know, that's how big the Jack Johnson fight was in Sydney in 1908. But the year before that, Jack Johnson had been in Australia, and as a result of his visit to Australia, he inspired a small group of Aboriginal people in Sydney who later on in the early part of the 20th century became followers of Marcus Garvey, the father of international black nationalism, you know, and the sort of ideas that developed from there led to the creation of the first modern-day Aboriginal political movement organisation in 1924. Now, this is the unknown history of Australia. You look at the sort of level of debate in the Australian community at the time, in you know, right up until 1920 even, and you see really perverse sort of xenophobic, white supremacist, racist nonsense being peddled in mainstream Australia. Whereas some of these early Aboriginal political activists, by comparison, were incredibly sophisticated in their political thinking. This is all part of the early part of the story that I'm talking about, and through which I am connected because, as it turns out, my great-grandfather was an ardent follower of the ideas of Marcus Garvey about self-determination, economic independence.
Marcus Garvey was a character picked up by a lot of the Rastafarians in Jamaica again in the 70s.
And Malcolm X.
Yeah.
You know, let's not just talk about the dope smokers.
Yeah. Those people you mentioned that Jack Johnson met with, you talk about in your show, Fred Maynard and Tom Lacey, they formed the Australian Aboriginal Political Association, and through many of this, because it's called a history, but through your personal kind of relations with people, you mentioned your grandfather, but that you also met a contemporary historian from Newcastle who's also a grandson of Fred Maynard.
The person who rewrote the history of the first Aboriginal political organisation was in fact the grandson of Fred Maynard, one of the founders, one of the followers of Marcus Garvey, one of the guys who met Jack Johnson in 1907. And it's a pretty extraordinary story, and it's an aspect of Australian history that Australians need to know if they're to look upon and think about Aboriginal people today in a different way, because to this day we've got this lunatic Minister for Aboriginal Affairs from out there in Heidelberg, Jenny Macklin, still portraying Aboriginal people as victims. We're the perpetual victims in the minds of white Australia, Aboriginal people are always portrayed in mainstream media and in popular culture and in the education system as victims, whereas the truth of the story is radically different. Aboriginal people have been strong agents of change in their own communities ever since the early 1920s, and the strong movement for self-determination that is denigrated by some today and dismissed by some today, and is said by some today to have failed. It's a nonsense, because genuine self-determination has never, to this day, been achieved by Aboriginal people in their political struggle. And that struggle's been going on for a long, long time. And the modern phase of that began with the first modern Aboriginal political organisations in the early 1920s. And there's an unbroken line, an unbroken, consistent theme from the 1920s right through to this day. Camp sovereignty during the Commonwealth Games here in Melbourne.
There's so much in the show, and we'll perhaps have a break for a minute and play some music. But I might mention, Gary, I went to see the brilliant documentary about West Indies cricket, because we played some reggae before. And it's a link with Australia and Jamaica, West Indies, because they fashioned their team in the 70s, these conquering team who were never defeated for 15 years. But I'd seen your show, and you mentioned there was a slogan Marcus Garvey had, I think, one God, one people, one destiny. And the West Indies cricket team had that as well.
There you go. And the first modern Aboriginal political organisation, the Australian Aborigines Progressive Association, in 1924 in Sydney, had exactly the same motto as well.
Yeah, amazing.
There you go.
Gary, apart from the fact that you were born as an Indigenous Australian, what particular events were there that shaped you into spending your life as an activist?
Well, when I was 17, I was thanks to the do-gooders, I'd been given this opportunity to be an apprentice draftsman. I suppose they call it draftsperson nowadays. So I was an apprentice draftsman, and had things have proceeded normally, I may well have become part of the first wave of the black bourgeoisie, and went on to become I was keen on being an architect. So who knows, I could have designed something. But unfortunately, living in Redfern in 1967 was a mean place. And I've always said that two things really changed my life at that point. Number one, I got a good kicking from the corrupt coppers of the New South Wales Constabulary. And they were corrupt in them days. We're talking about the days of Robert Askin, who is now acknowledged as one of the most corrupt premiers in Australia, in New South Wales history, and that's really saying something in itself. But these corrupt coppers gave me a good kicking in Regent Street Police Station when I was 17 years old. And the only problem with that kicking was that I hadn't done what they were kicking me for. And that really, really pissed me off. In fact, it's very ironic. I think back and I think, well, had I have done what they accused me of, I probably wouldn't have got as upset, and I probably wouldn't have got the fire in my belly and went on to become a political activist. But I got a good kick in. I was really, really, really angry because I hadn't done what they'd kicked the shit out of me for. And a week later, a young black fella in Redfern said to me, told me he was trying to pull together a group of young people to see what we could do about the police harassment and intimidation of blackfellas in Redfern. And he didn't have to ask me twice. I mean, I was one of the first people who said, okay, I'm with you. And from that, I mean, when I said yes, he handed me a book. And he said, read this, which I thought was a bit bizarre because I was 17 years old. The last thing I was interested in the world at that moment was reading books. But I read it, and the book was Autobiography of Malcolm X, and it changed my life. I mean, what Malcolm was saying about what was going on in America, I understood instantly, immediately, because it was going on to us in Redfern, and the things he was saying about, in the end, about ways of getting around this made us start to think, and that led to a little group that we adopted and adapted a few ideas from the Black Panther Party in America, and we set up a pig patrol in Redfern, monitoring the coppers. And that led to the creation of the first free shopfront legal aid centre in Australia, the Redfern Aboriginal Legal Service, and that became the focal point of what became known as the Black Power movement, and ultimately the self-determination movement, ultimately the Aboriginal Embassy. So it was essentially two things: coppers giving me a kicking for something I didn't do, and reading the Autobiography of Malcolm X.
You talk about being in Redfern. You in your show you mentioned you come from northern rivers of New South Wales, where
Gumbaynggirr land, Nambucca Heads, not northern rivers, mid-north coast, subtropical paradise.
And your diligent historical research, you've identified that as the area where the most handsome, best-looking black fellas in Australia come from.
It comes after extensive historical research in the Baillieu Library at Melbourne University.
But you talk also about Redfern, and in your show you identify Redfern becoming a place where Aboriginal people were drawn to from the outskirts of Sydney.
Well, it wasn't drawn to. I mean, in 1967, the old Aborigines Protection Act in New South Wales was effectively closed down after the 1967 referendum. And up to that point, more than 45,000 Aboriginal people throughout New South Wales had been largely confined by law to these places called Aboriginal reserves. And so suddenly the gates of the concentration camp opened, and there was this mass exodus of Aboriginal people from the rural areas in New South Wales, because there was no work, no way to survive in the rural areas in the mid to late 1960s in New South Wales. And so the Aboriginal population of Redfern went from, in 1966 when I first got there was about 1,500 blackfellas in Redfern. And within 2 years, there were 35,000, which made it the biggest Aboriginal community in the history of Australia. And 35,000 people, mate, and every single one of us was impoverished. There was no black bourgeoisie then, you know. If you owned a good pair of shoes, you were probably considered pretty bourgeois. But apart from that, everybody had nothing. And you got to remember also that this is at the height still of the White Australia policy. So Sydney was a big white place, and in the middle of that big white place was this little black blot called Redfern. And that led to all sorts of harassment, intimidation, discrimination, racism, often in the form of the New South Wales police, who, like I said, were an incredibly corrupt bunch of thugs. You know, that's been long historically established. I'm not saying anything controversial there.
Perhaps you could give our listeners your perspective on that referendum you just mentioned, the 67 referendum.
Well, I mean, the 1967 referendum is a really historic moment in Australian history. In excess of 90% of the Australian people who voted in the 1967 referendum effectively voted in support of justice for Aboriginal people. That's what that referendum was promoted as in the campaigns leading up to it. The Australian people were told, if you believe in justice for Aboriginal people, if you believe that Aboriginal people have been hard done by, then vote yes in support of Aboriginal people. Now, 90%. I mean, that's extraordinary. And that was one of the first referendums in Australian history since Federation that the Australian people actually voted yes, because Australian people are not stupid. They've shown a very healthy disrespect for the opinions of politicians for the greater part of the 20th century, and they had very rarely ever, if ever, voted yes to a proposition put in a federal referendum by politicians. And so it was pretty extraordinary as in that sense alone. But then 90% of people in a society like this, in a supposed democracy like this, that's about as close as you're going to get to unanimity in such a society. You know, and I say to my students, if you live to be 100 years old, you will never see another vote like that in an Australian referendum, you know. unless it's to get rid of Julia Gillard. Sorry.
Thanks. Feel free to pick any fights you like during the time.
That was particularly aimed at the Australian Losers Party, the Labor Party, rather than Julia personally.
No,
Gary, because there are a lot of since that historic 1967 vote, there've been a lot of high-profile Aboriginals. Aboriginals have experienced more than ever having a voice, working with people in power. Do you think, in your opinion, that you can make more of an impact working with bureaucrats and people in power, or agitating from the fringes?
Well, most of those who took that path in the 80s and 90s nowadays are amongst the most vehement critics of that path, because they know better than anyone else how they failed. I mean, effectively, Aboriginal people got screwed over, essentially not by John Howard or any of his right-wing lunatics. The people who have been most deceptive in terms of Aboriginal politics in Australian history have in fact been the Australian Labor Party. And it was Hawke and Keating who really killed off land rights. Hawke and Keating, well, Hawke in particular, people might recall, most of you are probably too young to recall this, but for your information, when Bob Hawke became Prime Minister of Australia in 1983, his loudly proclaimed policy on Aboriginal affairs was land rights for Aboriginal people. And land rights meant freehold title, the right to refuse mining on Aboriginal land, protection of sacred sites. You know, he was proposing extraordinary, what we'd been arguing about all through the 70s and 80s. You know, we were demanding land rights. We weren't out there in the streets limp-wristed running around saying native title now. We were saying land rights, and land rights meant freehold title of land, ownership of land. Hawke promised us that, but within 3 months of him promising that and, becoming Prime Minister and saying he was going to implement national uniform land rights legislation, he met up with the next most corrupt Australian politician in Australian history, a person who at the time was the president of the Australian Labor Party, a person who was the Premier of Western Australia, a person who since that time has gone to jail twice on corruption charges, Brian Burke. Brian Burke, on behalf of the West Australian mining industry, made Hawke back off his promise for land rights. The mining industry, Brian Burke and Bob Hawke, killed the land rights movement and destroyed the aspirations of Aboriginal people that Aboriginal people had had for the previous 100 years. And so what did we end up with when the Labor Party left power? We ended up with this Mickey Mouse thing called native title. Native title. What's native title? Native title's not ownership of land. I mean, the only thing you get if you got native title is the honour of being able to go in and into public ceremonies and welcome a bunch of decrepit British aristocrats and others and say welcome to our land. Big deal. It's meaningless. Native title is not land rights. That's one of the themes of my show.
Yes, we're talking with Gary Foley about his show from the 7th to 15th of October at the Arts Centre, part of the Melbourne Festival. You go through many events in Australian Aboriginal political history with Fitzroy, with Doug Nichols and Marg Tucker and Bill Onus, and there's a very thrilling part of it where you have archival footage of yourself and others in the Aboriginal Tent Embassy in Canberra. And you've also been able to access a lot of detail, which you thank the ASIO for providing. And you said they're the best record keepers a person could have.
Well, indeed. In the old days when I was young and mad, we didn't keep diaries, and over the years I've sort of collected and kept a lot of documents and stuff, but they only tell part of the story. If you want to get down to the detail of remembering who was at a meeting and who said what and things like that, that's not there on the record. But each year nowadays, I get it on the 1st of January, I get the latest instalment of my ASIO file, and not just my file, the files of other people who I was associated with at the time and the files on organisations that I was part of. And you very quickly discover that these old ASIO agents, whilst they collected a fair bit of trivia and nonsense and gossip and rumour, Sometimes they're actually pretty good record keepers, minute keepers at meetings. In fact, sometimes their minute keepers were better than ours. And so you can go back over, my file, and one of the things that I discovered is just how extraordinarily active the Black Power movement was. I mean, we're involved in lots of stuff with the anti-war movement, with the anti-apartheid movement, involved in because, broadly in society, then there was a lot of political activity, and it was an interesting time to live through. But you go back through your ASIO file and you see that we're at this meeting against US imperialism, and all these people were there, and Jack Mundy and Bob Pringle and Wendy Bacon and all these great people, and you get a full detailed rundown on what they said and everything, and it's great stuff. And not only that, on many occasions you've got photographic material to go with it, so that, and they're very meticulous, ASIO, because they keep records of who took, not who took the photos, but the manner in which the photographs was taken. There was a whole pile of pictures of when Chicka Dixon's group left to go to the People's Republic of China in 1972. A bunch of us went to see him off at the airport, and I've discovered these photos from ASIO of all of us at the departure lounge. And the method of photography, according to the file, was a suitcase in a camera. A camera in a suitcase. So there was some guy walking around with a suitcase taking all our pictures. And you get a full list of who was there, their file numbers, the works. It's very, very good stuff. Most entertaining sometimes too. But
the show I saw, you were doing it with a simple kind of laptop and a screen at the Trades Hall. Will you be taking advantage of more kind of theatre type presentation at the Arts Centre?
I didn't know how ancient my technological sort of equipment was until I started working on this show, and now I'm talking to some of these young whiz kids. G'day out there, you fellas. They're listening in, I think. Who are on doing the audio-visual stuff, and from what I've seen so far, they're doing some pretty extraordinary stuff. So it's going to enhance the whole thing to a far greater extent. And, those who were reluctant to come along because they thought they might have seen me give this talk before. Well, it's true. You have seen me give this talk before, but it's always different because it's improvised, and we've got this new high-tech aspect to it now. We've got it dressed up to look more like a theatrical production than a history lecture, which is what it probably is.
You've got a history in theatre, or at least film as well. Could you talk about how you became how you worked as an actor? For instance, you were in A Country Practice and The Flying Doctors and shows like this, as well as films such as Dogs in Space. What made you sort of veer off into the film and acting world?
Well, it's interesting because somebody asked me this morning what inspired me to say yes to this project. And what inspired me really was Jack Charles and his show in the Melbourne Festival last year.
Bastardy.
Yeah, Bastardy. Now, Jack, the reason that inspired me was because the person who first made me think about theatre as a possibility, as a different means of communicating stuff, was in fact Jack Charles. I saw him in a production in 1971 called Jack Charles is Up and Fighting. It was him and Bob Mazza and a young white actor called Ollie Lewinsky. And that was such a brilliant show, and Jack was such a brilliant actor then. He really blew my mind. I couldn't believe just how brilliant he was. And 6 months later, when Bob Mazza, who'd worked with Jack in that show, set up the National Black Theatre in Redfern, he asked me to join. And so I got involved in the first all-Aboriginal stage production, Basically Black, a show that the National Black Theatre bunged on in what was the original Nimrod Theatre in Sydney. In fact, the original Nimrod Theatre in Sydney was put on its financial feet by us, the National Black Theatre. We were the first show that ever made money. We played to packed houses for a whole season, 6-week season at the original Nimrod, made money for them, and the last show we did was on the night that Gough Whitlam got elected Prime Minister of Australia. And so that was some night.
And you talk of like the acting world there, and I think I remember reading an interview with you in the early part of this century, and you were You were talking as if you were an elder and you were going back to northern New South Wales to kind of be in your country or something. Did you have some sort of thing that changed you and brought you back to Melbourne to get into the academia and become more active again?
Well, I had a big surprise, that's for sure. I had it in the form of my first daughter.
Mm.
Now, I've had a significant problem escaping the clutches of Melbourne.
Mm.
I moved here 42 years ago. I mean, I was saying earlier on that I come from subtropical paradise. Anyone who's been to Nambucca Heads on the north coast of New South Wales will know what I mean. It's the most beautiful place. And yet I've spent 42 consecutive Melbourne winters here, you know. Now, that means something. There's some sort of message in that. I believe that Melbourne is and I tell my American students, when I was teaching at Melbourne University, I used to get a lot of American students. They loved me for some reason. And they all used to call me Professor. Hey, Professor. I said, I'm not a professor. Oh, never mind, Professor, yeah. But I used to say to these American students, you're lucky that you've arrived in Australia in Melbourne, because Melbourne is the last isolated outpost of civilisation on mainland Australia. And I used to say to them, now, when you go racing off in mid-semester break to go racing off to the Gold Coast and to the Barrier Reef and Arnhem Land and all that, you should remember one thing. As soon as you reach the edge of the tram tracks in Melbourne, you're headed straight for the land of dangerous, venomous Australian creatures. And I say, I don't mean red-bellied black snakes or red-backed spiders, I mean rednecks. And so off they'd go. And they used to come back, these Yank students, and, you know, they'd say, hey, Professor, you were right about those rednecks.
And the measure of the kind of continuing need for people like you to be telling a story, Gary, in the show, you show a picture of early 70s, I don't know whether it's the Aboriginal Legal Service or medical school, and it's a picture of you with a group of students who are younger than you, and you're in your 20s then, and you note that most of them, although younger than you, are no longer with us. It's quite a poignant moment.
Well, it's a picture of not long after we set up the legal service, we set up a whole series of self-help organisations. It was all about Aboriginal people taking control of their own affairs, taking control of their own organisations, retaking control of their own destinies. That's what the Black Power movement was all about. And so the next thing after we set up a legal aid centre to stop the harassment by coppers, very quickly after that we set up a free health clinic with the help of people like Fred Hollows, young, mad, commie Fred Hollows. And that photograph was taken outside the first shopfront centre we had for the Redfern Medical Service, and there was a bunch of young teenagers. And I say, well, you know, these are the young people who we in the Black Power movement, we were creating all these possibilities for the next generation, and this was the next generation. These kids are only about 6 years younger than us, but they were all about 15, 16, these kids, and there was about 40 of them in this photograph. And the tragic thing today is, and as evidence that nothing's really changed, nothing's really changed since my day, the majority of the kids in that picture are either dead or in jail. The majority of them are dead, but those who ain't dead are dying or incarcerated, The great irony in Australia today, which nobody seems to care about, is that, 20 years ago we had a Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody that found out the reason so many blackfellas are dying in custody because there are so many blackfellas in custody. 20 years ago, Australia had the highest rate of incarceration amongst Aboriginal people of any country around, comparable Western country. Today there are more Aboriginal people in jail than there were back then when the Royal Commission was set up. The main recommendations of the Royal Commission were designed to stop Aboriginal people from going to jail in the numbers that they were. They weren't going to jail because they were bigger criminals than anyone else. They were going to jail because of the inequities in the criminal justice system in Australia. That's what the Royal Commission found. Those inequities not only persist, in most instances they've got worse. So, there's still a lot more to fight on for. But I'm getting a bit old. I don't want to be doing this. I want to get some of the next generation out there doing it.
Well, it's quite an inspiring story you're telling at the Arts Centre anyway. Perhaps we could hear a song you've picked. This is Harry Belafonte, and you mentioned you'd uncovered some film of him in Australia.
Yeah, before we play this, Harry Belafonte features in this story, as does Roy Orbison and a range of other people, Joe Strummer and others. But I, after a few years, trying to track down footage that I knew had been filmed by old Bill Onus, one of the legends of Aboriginal Australia from Melbourne. He was a Super 8 film enthusiast in the 1950s, and when I finally found the tiny amount of film that still survives of what he shot, among it was some extraordinary footage of some people standing up in Belgrave near old Bill Onus's boomerang shop in Belgrave. And standing out the front was Harry Williams, this legendary Aboriginal country and western singer and guitarist, teaching Harry Belafonte how to throw a boomerang. And watching on was both Bill Onus and Doug Nichols. I mean, it's quite an extraordinary little, 2-minute clip of film, but it's pretty amazing stuff. So,
Gary also mentions Harry Belafonte's political activism in the show. You mentioned Jack Johnson before, Paul Robeson, of course, always made contact with the dock workers.
It's interesting because in the 60s in Sydney, a lot of African American in particular, but also people like Buffy St Marie, whenever they visited Australia, they always made contact with Aboriginal people, Aboriginal organisations, and very frequently did free concerts for the Aboriginal community in the Foundation for Aboriginal Affairs in Sydney. And the other major factor, I think, that sort of introduced a lot of these sort of ideas to us was the fact that during that period in the late 60s, when Sydney became an R&R centre for American troops in the Vietnam War, a significant number of those troops who were coming to Sydney were African American troops, and many of them, when they hit Sydney, said, where's the black community? And naturally there's no black community in Sydney except us. And with them, they not only bought some really nice grass, but they, more importantly, bought a lot of interesting political literature that wasn't able to be accessed in Australia.
We're coming to the end of BLB here, Gary, and
No
I
worries.
guarantee you this is what Gary Foley's show is going to be like.
If you want to
at
hear the rest,
Arts
come to the
Centre.
show.
There's always more to tell, and they'll be closing the curtains and Gary will still be talking. Thank you very much.
It's a great pleasure to have you on, Gary.
Yeah.
Thank you
No
so
worries.
much.
Thank you very much.